Welcome back to another episode of On the Path. This is episode 2 of season 3. We are doing the uh, battlefield tactics and strategies intermediate level for this one. So this is going to focus on some more in-depth abilities. We're going to go over some new things to process, to think about, as well as we're going to start getting into the weeds on some stuff. So last episode was about an hour long. This one is probably going to be quite a bit longer. There is a link to the document that Zach and I will be using, Balder and I will be using to make the conversation move forward and everything. So pull that up if you'd like. Otherwise, you can just follow along. I'm also going to share some games and some designs that are going to let us see things a little better, perhaps let you, create your own plans, things like that. So with that, let's get started. I am Merrick the 15th, technically Battlemaster Merrick the 15th now, and I am joined by Battlemaster Balder Highwind. Almost added 15th to your name.
Hello.
If you've listened to the Bard episode, you've heard Zach, you've heard Balder before. We've been playing together since pretty much the beginning, and we've been playing sports and stuff together since we were little children. So a lot of this stuff we're gonna relate some stuff to sports. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with like plays and how sports are put together, we're gonna talk about some of that stuff. One of the main reasons for that is because there's a lot of research about how sports plays are put together. It's very easy to relate sports plays and how to build like a strategy in a sport to what we do. So we'll go more into that in a minute. But we're going to start off with, I'm going to repeat the quote I started with last time, which is Bradley's adage: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Remember that the facts of the fight matter more than what you think should be happening. Regardless of if your theory is sound and you believe you have the right answer to the problem, if it's not working in the moment, it's not working. So remember this throughout all of your strategies and your tactics, because it's something that I apply to all mine, and it applies to a lot more than just Battlefield. Zach, you want to do the next one? Balder, you want to do the next one? I'm going to mess that up a lot.
So the plan never survives the enemy. A lot of times when you make a plan ahead of time, you make strategies and tactics and you tie them all together into a game plan. Typically, once it hits the field, something is going to go wrong. There's going to be things that the other team does to counter your strategy. There's going to be things that happen when you are trying to implement certain tactics, etc. And things are not always going to go the way you want them to. And so you have to have backup. You have to be able to go with the flow. If you keep things simple, then you're going to have a lot easier time explaining them to your team. You're going to have a lot easier time implementing them on the fly, making changes. Because the more simple you keep it, the easier it is to understand. And the easier it is to understand, the easier it is to change and still have it be understood. And for this to be brought to sort of a maximum effect, you need to practice your tactics. And you just need to practice them over and over and over until they become natural. And another thing that adds on top of this is knowing how your team is going to react when you come into certain situations. If you have people on your team who are going to step up and fill holes, if you have people who are going to crumple under pressure, knowing that also helps you to react on the fly and build strategies around certain scenarios and around your team and who you're working with. Merrick, if you want to explain coward versus hero.
Oh yeah, so this is an idea that essentially in any group of people, one person will be a coward, one person will be a hero. It kind of breaks down. any group of people will have a close to 50-50 split of coward versus hero. Now, the levels of those things change very drastically, but somebody is going to want to attack while someone is going to want to retreat most of the time. So knowing who your cowards are, and I'm not saying that in a bad sense. I'm saying that as in somebody who's going to defend is going to take the defensive action versus someone that's going to take the offensive action. It's just the theory is coward versus hero. So when someone gets pushed and they panic and they don't have a reaction, they don't have a planned idea of what's supposed to happen, they're going to fall on their natural instincts, which are either going to be to fight or to flight. Pretty much. One of those two is going to happen. If you know who those people are and how they react, or if you can lean more into those styles of reaction, you're going to get a better result from your team members when you're coming to those results of like, oh, this went wrong. I can see why it went wrong because I had a bunch of people that are playing tanks are all of a sudden trying to be the hero. And a tank is not great at killing a lot of people normally, but they are great at defending themselves, which would be more indicative of the coward position of backing up, defending, and holding a position. It's a little bit of human psychology, Amcard psychology in there, but if you start learning what who acts in these ways, you'll start seeing tendencies a lot more as you go on. It's tricky to get down, I won't lie, but it is definitely a benefit once you have it kind of mastered or in your regular toolkit. The plan never survives the enemy. I mean, Balder and I have been on the same team for a bunch of different keeps, a bunch of different battle games, kingdom wide. And like, we've had strategies that we've been like, this is exactly what we're going to do. And then we're going to do it. And like, I don't know. I want to say like 30% of them probably go according to plan. Yeah.
Maybe less.
There's a couple I can think of that were like, this is the plan and this is what happened. And they're the same thing. And then there's pretty much all the rest of them that are not that scenario. Like, this is the plan and part of it happened, or a percentage of the plan happened. There's a couple of them I know that were just straight up like, this is the plan, and then none of it happened. The whole thing just did not happen. If you're getting deterred because you're trying to make strategies and they're not happening on the field, don't worry. That happens a lot. You're going to remember the ones that work, and you're going to see things about the ones that work to make it better, to continue to improve your ability to be a strategist and a tactician, so that you create strategies that hold up under pressure even better. Yeah. We've got some new terms as well. Terrain, it fits under one of the resources. It's a field resource. It is any field or non-player based imbalance, i.e. hills, choke points, walls, doors, field edges. You're playing on a game that has like hard lines where you can push people out. That's a terrain effect that you're going to want to play with. The way forests, if you're, running through the forest, you got to deal with what's in the forest. So that's an environmental terrain that you're going to have to deal with. And each of them have their own benefits and deterrents, but they are a resource you're going to have to deal with. When we say terrain, that's what we're referring to.
So kiting is pulling or drawing opponents away. It's typically more of an organized retreat and a defensive type action. So this is something that you would want more of your cowards to do rather than your heroes on your team. And typically what this does is it pulls people out of position in order to gain an advantage. If the enemy team has a front line and you want to pull some people off of the end of their front line to give your front line a bit more of a numbers advantage, then you could try to pull some people off the end of that line and kite them away and pull them out of position in order to get that numbers advantage for your team.
This is, we've got homework. The homework that I had for you last time, by the way, if you figured out why better players like being on the ends, and you see the power of being on the ends of ditch fields, part of it is kiting, because if you take that scary, big, awesome player off that flank and don't let them run your back line because you've kited them away, your team doesn't lose in 5 seconds because no one could deal with X Warlord or X Battlemaster or whatever on the side of the field. Kiting is personally, kiting is one of my favorite tactics because if you have perceived threat, if you are a scary player, or if you can create the perception that you're going to be a scary player, more people will dedicate time and energy to trying to deal with you. And if you can just keep pulling them out of position, you're going to do great. We'll get into more of that a little bit later, but I love kiting. It's one of my favorites. Those are our new terms. If there are terms that we say during this episode that you don't really know what we're talking about, please put them in the comments, or please message so we can explain them. We use jargon constantly. Balder and I have a lot of years of talking strategy, and some of it doesn't always make sense to an outsider or someone that isn't used to our experiences. So if there is something, please let us know.
One thing that maybe we could do as well is when we finish the series, just go through everything and make a list.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, there's certain things we just say that are quicker to say in a funky way, like ProProj is protection from projectiles, because saying protection from projectiles takes too long. But saying ProProj is really easy. This is one of those things. I also want to do a quick review of the homework from last time, because I did give homework. And then how we utilize that and build on it will kind of come as we go through things. So some of it, the make 2v1s, is the purpose of making 2v1s is to get used to finding ways to make advantages, because that's the easiest way to take an advantage, is use a numbers advantage. There's a lot of numbers on the field normally, and using numbers advantages is quick and easy. Be the far flank. I wanted you to understand what the flanks do and why you try to put big scary players on the ends, and why big scary players like the ends. The feints we're going to build on. So keep in mind if you did the practice of doing some feints and things like that, keep in mind what happened, and we'll talk about it a little later. The battle game, find each resource, literally is something that I do almost every time I step on a field. It's just kind of a quick glaze over of what everybody's kind of got, and any of the resources that are either in mass abundance or in hard scarcity, I find quickly, because the other ones don't matter as much, but the ones that are going to be in abundance and the ones that are in scarcity are useful to know every single time.
Advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, those as well. Yeah, you want to see that. You want to see the advantage and disadvantage compared to each team, as well as what are things that are advantages or disadvantages that are unclaimed, like environment and terrain space that is unclaimed until taken. So those are things that you may want to note as resources without taking effect who has them yet, and that they can trade hands. Exploiting the scarcest. This is a resource management game for the most part. I talked about that last episode because almost every time it is. If skill is the low resource, exploit that. If numbers are the low resource, exploit that. If terrain is the lower resource, exploit that. If you take the thing that is scarce in our game, you are more likely going to end up with the strong side of that tactic or strategy, regardless of what you're trying to do. It also falls under objective things. When you have the objective, whatever it is, you have the resource, you control the game. This applies especially in move the resource games. Today, before the tournament, we played Murder Ball. The Murder Ball is a basic game. If you haven't played it before, everyone has a single stick. Everyone has one life. Everyone has a respawn that's relatively quick. And the ball is death. Anytime it touches you, you die unless you hit it with your sword. Your sword is the only thing that cannot die to it. You have to get it through the opponent's goal, which is normally 10-ish feet across, and it's just on the ground. if you give up that resource, if you kick the ball or hit the ball to the opponent, they now control the game because they control the resource, the literal scarce resource. This happens the same with capture the flags, life pool games. Whoever's able to control their life pool better. A lot of that was acknowledging that that's going to happen, and then just keep doing this. Some of these homework you can keep doing and just practice adding things to it. Make the plan is something that I think you should always do, even if you aren't the one in charge. I know that I like making plans, and then even if they're not the plan, like if that's not the plan we decided to go with, I compare what I think what is going to happen in my plan versus what did happen or what the complications were, and see if my plan potentially could have worked with what did actually happen on the field versus what didn't. Sometimes it turns out better, sometimes it turns out worse, but it is always good practice to make the plan, even if it's not the one on the field. Okay, that was homework. On to tactics, improving our tactical game.
So when it comes to building tactics, again, you want to be planned, you want to be practiced, you want to work together with the people that you're hoping to play alongside and get to a point where these things feel natural. You can just say what you're going to do and everybody knows, everybody's ready. Um, so you need to design, plays, tactics, strategies, um, so that everybody has a purpose in the team. You don't want anybody to be hanging out without really having a job to do. If everybody has a job, everything's going to work better. And one of the easiest ways to think about this is just to set up tactics like plays in sports. So, in football, you have different plays that you can set up. I can't even remember, honestly, what any of them are called because it's been so long. But
I was thinking of like the year we used Disney plays for the lacrosse team, and we basically made like JV, which is the junior varsity, it's the lower team, basically made a play for like the 5 basic transitional things that were going to happen during the game. So like either we gained the ball, we lost the ball, we controlled the ball, or we were on defense. And like that was or the starting face off. Like that was basically what we did in JV, and then we advanced and made alternate versions of each of those in varsity, but a lot of them were the same thing. Like looking back on it, our coach was kind of just playing with like 1 or 2 positions to mess with what we were doing.
and I mean, you can make a lot of different tactics that hinge off of the same stuff and change very minor things, and they can be applicable to a very wide variety of scenarios. But typically, you want to have each person within these tactics have sort of a start and end point, a goal of where they're supposed to end up and what they're supposed to be doing. These tactics should flow really well between all the different moving parts, all of your players, and if you can, honestly, try to make some of your tactics flow into other tactics as well. So if you need to change things on the fly, you can do that just by calling out to your team what you're changing to. And if you're practiced, you can just switch it up and head out in with the new tactic.
It's trying to think of a good example that we can use that'll work. Okay, so in lacrosse, you start with a face-off where you have the teams lining up, and everybody has specific positions, similar to the way we start with jugging and some other team-based games, small team-based games. And then from that point, you want to have a reaction because that face-off can go one of 2 ways. Either you win the face-off and the ball goes the direction you want, or you lose the face-off and the ball goes not the direction you want. And a plan for both of those was like a necessity on our fields. For us in Amp Guard, you can kind of think of it as the same way. Like are you at advantage or are you at disadvantage? Like immediately coming up to that opponent lineup, whoever they are, whatever you're facing off against, are you at advantage or disadvantage? You can have a plan for both of those, and then you can move from those starting points and continue to make various options, because it's going to change a little bit based on what you're doing, but also which situation you're in.
Another big point for building these tactics is they can't be built in a vacuum. You have to build them understanding that your opponents are going to get in the way. Again, it goes back to no plan survives the enemy. Um, if you build a tactic that specifically only works if you have these certain things happen, the second somebody gets CC'd, the second somebody dies to a stray arrow, these tactics are going to start falling apart very quickly. You have to have flexibility, and you have to acknowledge where and how people are going to start stepping in to try and intercept different parts of these tactics, different players on your team, and looking for ways that you can counteract that, work with that to create advantages for your team so far as positioning goes, so far as matchups go. Trying to find any kind of advantage that you can work into the weak points of your tactic that you know that people are going to step in and try to exploit.
When you have set movements, it should be very obvious where the weaknesses are going to be, because those are going to be like gaps, or they're going to be openings, or they're going to be a person that's kind of playing a role they shouldn't be, or in a position that they might have to play a role that they shouldn't be. Like if you have two teams of 5v5 and you have three tank and you have two tank players, a DPS player, a CC, and a support. Those two tank players are not going to be great playing the DPS very often. They're going to be terrible playing the support class or the support version, because they're not set to do that. If your tactic involves or relies on one of the players playing something outside of their natural ability or outside of what their class is designed to do, that's going to be an obvious weak point, and that's something you're going to want to try to avoid, because the ultimate goal of a tactic is to increase your advantage while decreasing the disadvantage and limiting your risks as much as possible. Sometimes that means you have to take risks, but other times, a lot of the time when you take that risk, you have to make sure that you're putting in the strength or getting an advantage out of it that's large enough that it is going to matter.
I think probably a good example of making a tactic and understanding where your advantages are and where people are going to start intervening to oppose your tactic or counter it, or just getting in the way, is like for ditch. If you have your front line, but you also want to flank, you have a couple people who break off and they go for a flanking route. One of the biggest disadvantages of your tactic is the gap between your front line and your flanking group. And if too many people get into that gap, they can create numbers advantages for their team because they're effectively splitting you into two smaller teams. And so that's where you would work in a kiting counter plan, or trying to figure out a way to negate the risks and lower the damage when people do try to throw in wrenches into your plan, just to create as many advantages as you can, and understand that people are definitely going to try and exploit the weak part of that tactic.
And that you can plan for that. That's something that is available for you to mess with, is like if you see someone you see a weak point in your play, if it's obvious enough, you can potentially make it so that that is the thing they target, and that's what you want them to do. You build into that point, that is the weak point. They take advantage of the weak point. You then exploit what's going on, because either by taking advantage of the weak point or by putting themselves out of position, you now have the advantage to do something. There's the last, I think it was Small Teams Tactics. I'm not sure if this part came through last time, We'll find out. This Aha! It works. Okay. Ignoring the classes that are built into this what we're looking at right here, just focus on the equipment essentially. You've got sorting board, pole arm, sorting board, 2-stick. Straightforward right there. Other side, 2-stick, sorting board, pole arm, sorting board, 2-stick. Slightly misaligned teams. One side has slightly more tank, the other one has slightly more DPS, because 2-sticks is obviously going to be more offensive, but it's not as good at defending, where the tank abilities of the board are going to matter a little bit. They're both in a similar, layout. If you've got people coming, the pole is not in the front, but it is able to hit people in the front. You've got 2 sorting boards on each side, and then you've got your outside flank pieces, especially with the DPSs on the outside. One of the things that I like doing is a bait feint, which makes a very obvious weak target. It makes somebody the point of interest. That implies that this team here coming up, if they just charge this team, they now have a 5v4. So that advantage is theirs. What they're not taking into effect is the fact that this player moves and can now get behind and create more problems. If they take the bait and either go after, if they decide to take the bait and go after the one player, this one player is almost 100% guaranteed to move faster than this team is. And you can either spread them out where they end up chasing people and getting out of position, so they're no longer in a good defensive position, and you have the rest of your team able to work together to disassemble this opposing team, while your 2-stick or your bait is going to just keep defending they're going to keep kiting and holding themselves alive, either through threat of space or threat of movement, whatever. They're going to do something to stay alive as long as possible while the rest of their team disassembles the opponents. If they don't take the bait as much and they decide to try to deal with it basically team to team and just let this player kind of do whatever they want, they end up running the risk of letting this player flank and getting kills on the back lines, turning players, which means they're going to be out of position for either the pole arm or the sorting board. It really opens up a lot of options because the one team has decided to take advantage of a free agent or a free roamer, basically, and the other team has to compensate for what they want to do with it. They can also do the same thing. This is where I talked about it a little bit. If 2 teams use the same tactic, most of the time it ends up nullifying things, because if you have 2 teams and one side decides to have a free roaming agent, the other side does the exact same thing, we've just turned the fight into a 4v4 and a 1v1. It's flat again. There's no change of what's happening. If their agents decide to go different directions, it's still basically the same thing. You have one person trying to outflank and the other person trying to outflank with 2 4v4s going on. And it's if you watch it enough, it's very interesting to watch two tactics work at the same time that are the same thing. And if you've watched Belagarth, you know exactly what this is, and it's the toilet bowl, because most people are right-handed. So that right side, this might be backwards on Discord, I apologize, but the right side is going to want to take advantage. They're going to want to step out farther. They're better defending on their left side with their board. So this side normally progresses forward faster than the left side does. Same thing happens on the opposite side. So you end up doing this kind of twist, and it keeps happening until the whole field just keeps rotating, because the right side is chasing the opponent's left side and your left side is getting chased by your opponent's right side, and you toilet bowl, ending up with a twisting and like S-shaped defensive line, which is really annoying sometimes. Balder, you want to start talking about the like basic plays, and I'll use some examples.
So when it comes to putting these tactics into action in order to bring them to fruition with your entire strategy, um, you need to start with thinking about movement. Uh, Typically, anything that has to do with movement is going to be the very core of whatever you're trying to do. And having a team that can move quickly is as important as a team that can create good space in order for you to see threats coming and be able to prepare yourself for them and react to them accordingly. Uh, Space is time for everybody. Um, Gives you time to think, gives you time to recover, gives you time to reset. This also works for the other team. It works for both sides. And however you can bring your team to manipulate space, uh, getting good at that and working that into your tactics is going to put you ahead of other people because you are going to be able to close gaps quicker than other teams. You are going to be able to create gaps that allow your team the time that they need to react to the enemy. And again, that is a resource, that is an advantage and a disadvantage that can be manipulated and worked into these tactics. Uh, so uh, so far as general movements of a team and a tactic go, we have forward advancing, which is often pushing for an objective. We have flanking, which could be like sideways or angled, taking advantage of space to your flank. Retreating, which is falling backwards, um, maybe protecting an objective or falling into a defensive position, and holding, which is just a complete stoppage and just trying to like hold a point or defend a gate, hold a front line. So we can go back and we can talk about each of these a little bit more in detail.
Forward moving ones is ones you're going to have a lot of the time. You're going to, starting with forward is kind of the standard because you are going to want to move forward more often than you want to move backwards. It's kind of the rule of warfare is that you normally want to go towards the thing you want to take. It's very hard to go in a different direction. If you're doing that, whatever that movement is, you want to plan how you're doing it, because if everyone just starts running forward, they're going to run at different rates and people are going to get out of position. People might decide to spread a little bit too far or whatever. And now that positioning, that decision that you had made of like where everyone was now doesn't matter. And you're ending up with just kind of a line, which almost everybody uses line fighting already. So you're not getting any advantage from it. If your plan is to move forward in a specific way where you're creating like a tunnel point or something, or trying to push people in a specific direction. So like this here has a lot of defense on this bottom side because of the two shields. So if you want to try to keep things, you want to try to keep as much of their DPS counteracted by putting them on this side. So if you can position yourself moving forward and stepping sideways, you can try to negate this polearm, which is one of their DPSs, and this polearm by putting it on your defensive side, or two sticks, by putting it on your defensive side instead of putting it on your offensive side, where you end up with two sticks trying to fight against a polearm, which is normally not your right answer. But that practice of moving forward together, even just taking the steps together, matters. And it's an easy way to just get in the methodology and the thinking of how to get from point A to point B. If it's forwards or backwards, just moving together and sticking within your close range. I know in lacrosse, we had different ways of doing that. Like if you were playing defensive, the whole time you had to keep your lacrosse stick on your opponent. Similarly here, if you're the paladin, you want to stay close to this boardman's back as possible. You basically always want to be able to put your arm out and put it on their shoulder. So keeping that distance in mind, and then making sure that this caster, this yellow player right here, is not getting too far out. You have to kind of verbally tell them how close they need to be. That player could always try to keep the tip of the polearm within their view. This player could always try to keep, their line in a sight. And it's just a bunch of little practice like ideations of what you want to be, the positioning. Keep those while you move around and just keep them in mind. And while combat happens, people are naturally going to move around a little bit. You're going to end up with some shifting and stuff like that. But as long as you keep those general rules in play, whatever your tactic is, however you developed your layout, is going to still keep its power or its strength.
Flanking. I mean, flanking is something that I love to do. I'll do it as any class pretty much, no matter what my kit is, no matter what abilities I have. It's just taking advantage of your opponent's flank, manipulating space on the sides of the field rather than just running straight at each other. And you can try to do this more to the side, or you can take an angle to it. But the point of flanking is to try and get at your opponent's back line, or to try and warp their front line and force them to put themselves in a less advantageous position to give your team an advantage. Um, so when you're flanking, you have to keep in mind there's going to be a lot of openings, and you're going to be creating them. Like you being the flanker, you are going to create openings. You're going to create them on both the other team and on your team. Um, obviously, you are detaching yourself from the main group that is your team. You're creating an opening there, and you have to be mindful of that opening. But you're also possibly going to pull other players away from their team. You're going to create openings there. Uh, the main thing that you want to keep in mind with tactics that involve flanking is how you're going to manipulate those openings in order to create those advantages for your team, in order to create number advantages, hiding advantages, positional advantages. Um, Typically, if you are sending people on a flank, you want them to have a little bit higher of a DPS capability. If you're sending multiple people on a flank, you want their DPS ratio to be a little bit higher. And that's because if you are sending people on a flank and that flank is not met appropriately by the other team, that flank needs to be able to deal as much damage as possible once they get where they are going. So, these are your assassins, these are your scouts, these are your barbarians, these are, possibly spellcasters that are kitted out a little more defensively. Um, these are going to be people who have Florentine. These are going to be people, maybe if they have a lot higher skill level, they could get away with doing sword and board as a flanker. Not as much DPS, but their skill is going to make up for not having that second sword. Um, and essentially, when you get into that back line, when you get behind the front line, wherever your flank is aiming for, you want to deal as much damage as possible and create chaos for the other team. Um, and flanking can be very, very chaotic. A lot of things can go wrong with it. But again, that kind of feeds back into space and timing. You want to make sure that uh, if there's a possibility of something going wrong, you have given yourself enough space from certain members of the other team, like tanks, that you can see them coming and get away, not get caught by them if they decide to turn and try to come after you. And so while you're trying to create some chaos, while you're trying to find openings, you need to have a little bit of planned control set into your flanking tactics so that whoever is flanking has a has an out, has a way that if things go wrong, they can back up and they can get back to your team, and you can try something else.
It's like a good example on this, the little layout we have. Like if this 2-stick barbarian down here, decided they wanted to try to come and flank this side, this is probably not the fight they want to get into because they're against 2 sword and boards, which is more defense. Ignoring the class effects of like a barbarian and everybody else and the class abilities, if we're just looking at sword and board versus 2-stick, if these decide that they can take this on here, and there's a plan for the paladin to now step back over here and create a different setup, essentially, while keeping space, kiting around, whatever, this 2v1 is almost always going to end up in the results of the 2 against the 1, especially if if their skill levels are similar. Which then means you take that 2-stick off the field, regardless of what this team is kind of doing, as long as this other group is, playing defensive or keeping themselves away and just keeping it away from their 2 other friends, they're going to create a flank that can be utilized by these 2 tanks. They're not going to be as effective as 2-stick, obviously, but they are still going to be effective because they're just nobody's here to deal with them. Like there's 2, and in this scenario, this polearm could rotate to deal with these 2, and this druid could turn, but then that basically means that the druid is defending themselves on 2 sides, and this polearm is kind of free. Our polearm on the right or the left side, whatever it is free to kind of stab wherever they want and try to take things out. And that basically meant that the opponent's strategy of flanking didn't work because they just chose the wrong side, or the opponents had a plan to deal with a flanker. That's a lot of what ends up happening is if teams have tactics designed to deal with certain situations, if they have a plan to deal with something, they're going to deal with it much better than someone that's trying to use their natural instincts. Retreating is something I think a lot of amp carters don't do well, partially because it's not fun. Like, it's not exciting to retreat. You don't want to give up ground. You don't want to give up space. You don't normally want to leave whatever ground you've gained. You don't normally want to do that. But I'm going to tell you it is very advantageous to do it in certain scenarios. Like if you are fighting this battle and it's going back and forth, and the paladin or like the polearm user or one of these tanks on the side get wounded or have to go back for some reason, whatever it is, or if they're just getting overwhelmed, like this team here has enough skill that they're dealing with it, the retreat might just be the best option to give you time and space to think about what you need to do, reassess what's going on, and figure out how to move back into it, which we'll get into field command in a bit. But if that'd be the point that your field commander, which normally is like the center point or one of your tanks, because they have the best views, them giving like the call, like retreat, pull back, whatever, they come back out of that position, they get a second to see and kind of evaluate what situation's going on with, and then make the call from there of like, okay, forward advancement wasn't working, but I noticed that they have, two double sticks, they have two sticks on the outsides, so maybe we try to do something in that variety. Let's try a flank right. And they push that side, trying to take advantage of the fact that they have more DPS or more tank on this side than this DPS, and trying to line that pull up against this 2-stick. Retreating, as much as retreating doesn't sound fun, it is great to practice. It also means a reset. If your team is getting a chaos position or people are out of line, things aren't working the way you think they should be going, and you want to just get everyone back into position, calling a retreat back to base, not to base, but to start position is going to help a lot.
My most recent, very, very successful retreat tactic use was at Autumn Battlegrounds. We were doing capture the flag. It was sort of small teams. It was like maybe 6 or 7 people on a side, because the field was divided into different sections. But we kept pushing for the flag, getting the flag, bringing it back to score. But there's a downtime between when the flag is available again for you to take it, and some of our guys were very pushed up, and when we would get a flag, they would just kind of stay up there and meet the other team as they respawn, and they'd get swarmed and they would die. And then when the other team made a push, we would have one less person. Um, so I started calling retreats. I would start pulling people back. When we get the flag, just everybody comes back. Everybody sits at the back, regroups, assesses who is respawning, what they have, where they're gonna go, um, and proceed from there. And our death rate went way down. Uh,
Yeah.
so retreat doesn't have to be because you're overwhelmed. You could be winning. You could be obliterating the other team. But if your people get caught forward, then you have people who are being removed from the field. They're being removed from your tactics, and then your tactics aren't going to be as effective. They're going to be missing key parts. So sometimes, in order to move forward, you need to pull back. You need to retreat in an orderly fashion, regroup, assess the field, and then go.
Yeah. I know I watched at least 3 or 4 times where it was one of your DPSs was coming up forward, and you I think you were running 2 stick as well, but you had some armor. But you and your other commander basically called that player back from an overextension, being farther out than they should be. Like, if your strategy is because you guys are running smaller team groups. If you're running this group of 3 and or smaller squads, and you guys were running this thing, he sometimes would end up getting drawn out farther forward away from you two. So he was by himself dealing with, 3 to 5 enemies, and calling him back to start position essentially saved his life at least 3 times from my watching on the sidelines. Yeah. Like the retreat tactic is something that you don't normally think about you might want to do, but it's really important for keeping your players alive, because it's just holding resources and making sure they don't get put in the wrong positions.
Yeah, and retreat. A lot of people, when they think about a retreat, they think, oh, it's wholesale. Your entire group is retreating, but that doesn't have to be the case. You can have partial retreats worked into tactics, and that can turn into a kiting scenario. That can turn into an elongated flanking scenario. So it's important to try and think outside the box and not get caught up in uh, thinking about something how it's always thought about in generalizations.
Yeah, or
You
how
can you
you
can have
previously thought
partial
about it.
retreats. What's that?
Or how you previously thought about it. Like, don't get stuck with advancing means moving forward in a straight line. Like, no, it just means moving towards what you want, not necessarily straight at it.
Yeah.
I know this is this retreat tactic I've seen used a couple times, and it works almost every time, regardless of kind of skill imbalances on the other side. But if you've got a larger team set up and you have one squad kind of step back retreat, what it normally does is bring the other squad that's kind of facing them when it's kind of in these line fights forward. And it often puts the front of them out of position for the back of the other ones. And it allows you to kind of crash this side to just take out this entire squad by baiting them, kiting them literally back into a bad position while the rest of your team takes advantage. Because they still, even when they crash sideways, they still have most of their forward defense against the opponent, the other squadron. So this squadron just gets crushed from 2 sides while this one stays defensive, and this one is staying defensive. Like they're staying alive by keeping a little bit of defense by using their DPS locations. These guys on the outside to kind of pincer or hammer and anvil the opponent. And that, yeah, that starts with a retreat with a feint or a bait.
And I mean, with the setup that you have here too, the entire team doesn't even have to crash sideways into the team that has stepped forward. If that pole literally just switches from center to side, you've got, you've still got that defensive setup for your front team, for your forward team, and now you are exploiting weakness of the other team that has stepped forward to try and attack your retreating team.
Yeah. Like even these two just turning. Yeah, like you said, this now means that this druid, unless this team decides to retreat and get space, this druid is dealing with potential attacks from this polearm, this boardman, this 2-stick, and this poleman. That's a lot of attacks. This person is probably going to die quickly, meaning there's another opening that someone has to fill to protect that pole. And from there, it just falls apart very rapidly because you're just turning you're turning two teams into things. As long as this line here can hold for a short period of time and like defend against this, as long as you can break a little bit of this side, you're going to just sweep this side and you end up with two pretty strong flanks able to rotate. You take them out.
Once you pull people into a position where they're getting attacked from more than one side, you're putting a lot of pressure on them. They're probably not going to be able to survive it, depending on their skill level, etc. And if they don't survive it, you are immediately creating number advantages.
Yes.
So that's where retreating can really come into play, is partial retreats, creating different fluctuations in the front line and giving you advantages.
Yeah, I like retreats as baits and feints quite often because it's a lot of people, whenever they see a retreat, their brain, especially those that like to play the hero, are going to jump on it and be like, oh, they're weak, and they'll try to take advantage of it. The problem is, if you have a planned retreat, you are almost always stronger during the retreat than you are not retreating. So if you have a planned retreat or a planned regroup or whatever, that alone is stronger than just any like position that somebody is going to try to take advantage of. Because just by moving backwards, like, you know that these two are kind of far off on the side, and just call them back to base, they've immediately re-upped their defense. They're a lot stronger off. It's going to be a lot harder for this player to take advantage of them being out of position because they're getting back into position. Yeah, it's the having those ones, the forward, the flank, the retreat, and being able to always kind of come back to a core position that you want to be in is, or two positions, either a position of like we're in the advantage or we're at the disadvantage. Those two ideas is really a pretty easy way to start building tactics around what you have. Where it gets a little tricky is holds. I have only personally been part of 2 or 3 hold position tactics that have lasted, because it's hard to do without a lot of resources on your side.
Yeah. I like to think of it as the less you move, the more resources you need. So holds are arguably the hardest tactic to successfully, what's the word? Perform,
Yeah.
I guess.
You've got to put everything in the
simply
right
because
spot.
of simply because you are not moving at all, which means you need the maximum amount of resources to counter the fact that you're not moving.
Yeah, that resource of of move. The ability to move is kind of a resource because that's positioning. It is a resource. It's positioning. And if you're unable to change your positioning a lot, you've just created a scarcity that the opponent can exploit.
Yeah.
I without being in a castle and having the terrain of a door or a hallway or some kind of blockage to create a bottleneck, holding is very hard. But it's something you do want to practice because you might need to hold a location for a set period of time. You might need to defend your support for a minute while they cast Resurrect on somebody else, or you might need to do that for a different player or something. You need to know how to do it, but it is going to probably be the hardest thing for you to get down just because everybody needs to be on point and all of your resources need to be allocated appropriately. Otherwise, the disadvantages will stack up very quickly and you're going to get overrun.
Yeah.
The thing that is, I'm going to dip into it a little bit right now, but it is a little bit more advanced, is that holding does not necessarily mean no movement. It just means limiting how far you go backwards or forwards to do things, which is a lot of where that controlling space is. Like if you need to make this polearm person, this is your objective that you need to hold, kind of backing up to them and then creating enough threat to push forward and backing up again, creating space is a hold tactic. It's just real hard because it involves making sure that you have enough for the forward push and then also retreating correctly. It's basically taking two tactics and combining them to make one, which means a lot more moving parts, a lot more things that people have to remember, and a lot more parts to go wrong.
Something that hold has in common with retreat as well is typically when people think of holding, defending a position, whatever, it's the entire team doing it. You can also have partial hold. If your main group is going to be staying in one area or one spot, uh, that that is that's a big disadvantage. You aren't moving, and the movement scarcity creates a disadvantage for you. And the other team is going to be very mobile compared to you, depending on what they're trying to do or what the game is about. So you can make partial holds. Some members of your team can flank to counteract movement that the other team does. You can have um, sort of miniaturized retreats where you pull people in and you pincer them between two groups. You can kind of manipulate your front line to an extent depending on where you're holding and how. And so having a partial hold and having some moving parts added on top of the hold really helps to minimize the disadvantage that is brought on your team by lowering the amount of movement that you're doing.
Yeah. It's sometimes those are referred to as anchor points. I know that I refer to them as anchor points, especially in line fights. Like if the opposing team has started rotating around to another side, I might call like anchor outside or whatever. And that means that whoever's on that outside point, I want them to hold that location. I want them to defend and try to keep as much as possible because we're going to rearrange a little bit. Like this pole arm is now splitting between these two. This person either needs to come around for flank or come back to make the line defend again, because it's quicker for us to just hold a location, have one person rotate, and this person do a running instead of trying to get the whole team to do a full rotation. And then let this DPS but you have to practice that thing as well. You have to know what the plan is, because if you just say hold this location, this person's not going to really know what the direction is, and we'll get into that a little bit with tactics with random players that you're not practicing. But if you've got a team that can practice things, having those those partial hold locations or those counter movements that are going to be a partial hold it's going to make you more versatile, because obviously having more plays Makes you more versatile as long as you can keep them all straight, which is important. When you are designing tactics that you're going to like call out, like whoever the commander of your team is, your squad leader, it's not always the best idea to name your tactic whatever the thing is you want to do. Like, I know I mentioned earlier, but our lacrosse team used Disney movies for a bunch of our plays because we thought it was funny. Like, it was really great to yell Mufasa and then run a weird play. Like, it was fantastic. And doing that same thing, as long as everyone's on the same page on your team, you can call out whatever you want as long as they know what it means. And if the opposing team can't figure out what you're doing, that's another level of advantage that you've just gained over your opponent. That information gain.
When it comes to terminology and misleading words for plays, honestly, I always think that like American football, is probably the best example. Just because you have there's literally thousands of different plays that people have made for the game over time. You there's all kinds of shit that you can yell, and it's just like there's all kinds of stuff that you can yell.
You can yell. You can play some of this.
You could say winged T, and that's a whole plan for every single person. You could say we're running Wildcat. You could say we're running Blitz. Like you have all these different names that, to people who know, it means something. But if we're out on the field and I just yell to my team, Wildcat, what are you going to think it is? Nobody knows.
I mean, probably they're going to think it's your name, because that happens quite often. Is that like,
yeah,
some people do power play on that, but it is, if you're able to do practiced and pre-planned plays, naming them something other than what they are is great.
I mean, you can also like, while you are literally waiting for the snap to happen, the quarterback can call out nonsense words, and other people will know what to do based on those nonsense words. So, like the stereotypical, like, blue 42 set hut, and then you snap the ball. Like, you are changing on the fly according to what you see the defense doing, what you want to happen. Like, you're saying a nonsense word, you're saying blue. People understand what that means on your team and what they need to do. But to the other team, you're just shouting a color. Why are you shouting a color? What does that mean? We don't know.
That
And that's where it comes back to practice and planning and getting your team to work together and know what they need to do and why they need to do things. So you can say these nonsense words and your team will hear them and they will know what they need to do.
For starting off with building your tactics, I recommend trying to make an advantageous setup, like base setup, and then a disadvantageous base setup. That's just the position you want to start in for your plays. If you want to make it even simpler, you can just go with one and just assume you're at disadvantage, because it's always better to assume you have a disadvantage than to assume you have an advantage. The reason I say making the advantage and disadvantage positions, it just makes it easier to do certain plays. Like, if you are at advantage, you don't need to have your defensive line as close. You don't need to be as tight, and you can let that DPS or whatever run off to the side a little bit more and have some more space, because they're at the advantage. If you're in a disadvantaged location or disadvantaged situation, having that defense point is important. So start with a starting setup, which normally is something you can always come back to, is relatively simple, and has an advantage to it. Like the design we have up here, like this is definitely more of a defensive or disadvantaged starting point, where if I was doing something more advantaged, I would be a little bit more flat, because that means that I have less space that my DPSs need to run to make flank positions, depending on what plays I'm doing. Whatever your tactic is. But I'd start with the starting position, and then from there make a tactic that is each one of those movements we talked about: a forward or advancing one, the flank or a sideways angled movement, the retreat, and a hold. From that point, you're going to be able to expand on it a lot farther, but just being able to do those 4 is going to make you a lot more deadly as a team and survive a lot more situations. The last one is, it's kind of a tactic. It's also kind of an understanding how you're going to use it. I call it feint, and it's if you're going to be a feint as a team, as your squad. So if your squad needs to be the feint, how do you do that? What is the motions or the actions that you are going to do? It could literally be one of your other plays. It could be, well, we're just going to play forward or flanking, just farther off to the right or something like that. But sometimes it needs to be something you need to do something slightly more specific, or you need to do something that is more threatening than you are normally. It's a little tricky, and it kind of depends on the situations, but trying to plan for like a potential, we need to be a left flank or a right flank feint is a good extra spice to throw into your tactics. You have to make your feints actually threatening, though. A feint isn't going to be taken seriously if it doesn't have an actual potential to do damage. And part of the homework I gave you was to try to do feints and things like that purposefully weren't able to finish. Like, do a feint that is not going to do something if you follow through on it. Those kind of feints, as people get better, they realize that those feints don't matter and that thing doesn't really affect them. So they can ignore it. When you're making actual feints, you need to have an actual amount of threat you're going to drop on the opponent. And if they don't compensate for whatever you're doing, the feint can become the threat.
Basically, the way that I think about feints is that if you're doing a feint that won't lead to something if the enemy doesn't try to counteract it, you're just moving inefficiently and you're wasting time and you're creating disadvantages for your side.
Yeah. Feinting's a little tricky to explain in simple terms, but like if we can break it down to sword fighting, and if you're doing a feint, like you can do a punch feint, which is just a punch fake. You literally punch the air a little bit with your sword, and that implies that you're about to move in that in that direction with your sword. That might get people to move their guard or whatever. And if they don't do anything, you could just continue forward with that punch and then turn it into a strike. And that feint they didn't bite on the feint. So the feint can become the actual threat. Same if you're doing the tactics.
Yeah. And that's why it's also important, though, when you're throwing that punch fake, to throw it in a way that you can actually turn it into a real shot. Because if you throw it goofy out there and it's not a fake that you can turn into a real shot, then you're risking losing an arm or opening yourself up somewhere else for essentially nothing. You're doing useless movement.
And an example in team tactics of that would be like this 2-sticker coming out here. Yes, they are far away from the team. Yes, they could potentially become a threat and run this way. But currently, they have done no benefit by separating themselves at the moment. If they separated themselves at an angle, they've now become a threat because they are in this position. But just running away doesn't help them. So this would be equivalent to that punch fake that's just not useful. It can't turn into anything threatening, because this really can't turn into anything threatening within a reasonable amount of time. This angled movement can, but the straight out or even backwards really can't, unless you have, like, if you're moving back, you've got to do a lot more work to make this even a potential tactic. Because, like, yes, they can take advantage of this and then you can step up, but the bigger risk is the team just steps to the side and deals with your smaller side. So recognizing what you as a team can do to feint and still be threatening is part of that building a feint, is that knowing what you can and can't do and what you can feint to be threatening with, what you can fake do, essentially.
It also kind of ties back into the thought that movement is a resource, and resources can be wasted.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are, that's why feints are important to figure out and put in appropriately and act on appropriately when you are in a game. Um, because if you use a feint and it's not a good one, you're using movement and you're wasting that resource. Uh, so your team is losing out on movement that they could be making when you were doing a bad feint instead.
Mm. It's yeah, feints are a little tricky, but they're once you start getting them down where you understand what you're doing that is threatening, you can start using those things. And then once you get good enough to transition your tactics, or you've planned how to move from tactic to tactic to tactic, you will kind of always be able to turn anything into a feint, or turn anything that was supposed to be a feint into the actual play. And that's partially of the, like, if you build those 4, being able to go from any one of them to any other one of them and knowing how that movement is supposed to go is going to help a lot. It might mean at the beginning that you're just doing a lot of regrouping and moving, but eventually you're going to want to be able to move directly to whatever you want to do. Like if your defensive positioning is kind of a draw tank and this 2-stick is supposed to basically step back so that you have 3 DPS or 3 defense on the outside, and this person is literally just defending this pole arm from like a backside. If you always have to come back to that, it's going to be a lot longer than if you know that, oh, well, we can pull a left side flank and all we have to do is have this player rotate and this 2-stick can just run the other side. We've now switched which direction we're doing what we're doing, but because we knew that from A to B is a short, like we're moving from one tactic to the next, just finding the shortest answers to each option. That takes practice of each of your tactics. You have to know how each of them work and then know how they link together, which is, once again, practice your tactics. If you don't practice them, it doesn't matter how many times or how well of a tactic you came up with. If people aren't able to do it, it's not going to work. The other part of this is something that I want more players to understand, and a lot of players don't. And that is, you do not have to kill people in order to win fights. If you kite 10 people with your 5, you are winning the resource war because you have dedicated 5 resources to their 10. And advanced will get more into like perceived threat of like perception and reputation and things like that. But if you can basically make it so that they have to dedicate more resources to you versus what you're dedicating to it, you're immediately winning the fight because it's a resource game. If they're wasting their resources, you're winning.
I think that's honestly the biggest advantage of kiting is if you can get the enemy to waste resources.
Yeah. I love doing it, like as an individual, and we've done it. The tiger tactic, we had a tiger tactic we built for Dungeon Day, which basically was similar to this layout, but this 2-stick was Hopper. Hopper was in like 5-ish or 6-ish points of armor and had some immunities, and their job was to just sprint forward at the scariest person basically and try to kill him as quickly as possible. They were a hard bait. As many people, like immediately what was going to happen is that several people were going to turn on them and try to kill them, which now meant our tightly formed squad could just go disassemble the rest of the team while Hopper survived the fight because they have armor. And I think they were playing in Warriors, so they had armor that they could fix very easily. Plus they had immunities to deal with other things, and they could just keep harassing people at a disadvantage technically, while we as the rest of the team just blew up whatever we wanted. because we took out their biggest threat, and we did it with someone that was supposed to basically, we turned a tank into a DPS is basically what we did. But the point of them was still to be a tank, which is a little more advanced, but it was a super fun tactic because it was basically just a screaming girl in armor running at someone and then watching how the other team reacted to it and then taking apart anybody that didn't go chase them down.
And at the same time, you not only created a disadvantage for your team, but you used that disadvantage to create a larger advantage for your team.
It was a risk reward situation. If
Yeah.
if Hopper ended up running at the scariest person and that person ended up just like dispelling them and then killing them immediately, we would have lost out on that. We would have just lost Hopper in that fight. And the resources that would have been put into Hopper versus the resources that we would have benefited from were completely nullified, and we would have been like that. We would have had to change tactics at that point. But the times we practiced it worked exceptionally well because it was just a lot of killing for Hopper, which was awesome. Which does bring us to another thing you have to remember in your tactic. What do you do when people die? Because the plan never survives the enemy. Your tactic is not flawless. People are going to die during that tactic. How do you fill those spaces, and what are your next steps in those? Like, is there a balance point? Like, if you've got 5 people on your team and you lose 2, can you still perform certain tactics? Or do you have to retreat? Do you have to change up what you're doing? Is the balance point at 2? Is it at 3? Can you make the thing work if you've only got 2 people left or 1 person left? Like, you've got to know these breaks in your tactics. The other aspect is if you can recover them. If it's like a timed thing, like somebody comes back in 60 seconds or whatever, can you survive with that without them for 60 seconds? What does that tactic look like? Or if you can resurrect them, how long does it take you to resurrect them? How do you get to that positioning to be able to get them resurrected safely and then continue moving on? Like, all of those little bits are also going to be additional tactics and plays that you're going to want to know how to do. But a lot of them are still based off of the movement idea. Either they're a hold, they're a forward, they're a retreat. They're one of those things, but they just might be slightly modified based on who's still alive.
When it comes to loss of a player and recovering from that, I think of it in 3 different categories. One is death. If a player is killed and they have to go back to respawn, how do you make up for that? But also, how do you make up for if a player is hard CC'd? And how do you make up for if a player is brought just entirely out of position, not on purpose? So, if somebody gets iceballed and you don't have anybody in your front group who can release them, you have to either try to hold position and protect them. You have to try and push forward to make space between the enemy and them, or you have to retreat and leave them to possibly die. If somebody gets distracted and just runs off after an opponent's kite, or somebody isn't paying attention, or they get lagged and they can't keep up with your group during a flanking maneuver or something. These are all loss of a player, and so that's when those are all the different scenarios that you will be forced to make a choice of how you're going to fill that position, how are you going to make up for not having that position should you be unable to fill it, and whether you are going to try and protect, advance, or retreat in response to the loss, the kind of loss that has happened.
Is a good way to think about it. We talk about it in battle games. CC is almost often better than death because death has so many answers and our respawn timers are pretty short most of the time. But knowing how to deal with loss of a player in any of those scenarios are going to kind of be necessary so that you can continue to progress and not just like disassemble as a team when you lose one or two of your players. Like, you have to still know how to stay together and do what you need to do. A good way to practice that is doing ditch. is if your team gets together and like you guys are doing either ditch in just your team or ditch as a park or whatever, trying to team up with whoever is in your squad and then just trying to do plays or figure out which tactics you can do when you're losing players. And whenever, someone switches sides, you just act as that player's dead and that you have to, continue without them. It's a quick way to just get used to like, oh, we have to figure out how to fight without Tony, or we have to figure out how to fight without whatever, that we're not falling apart without them. The other thing to notice is when you're running your tactics, when you run those plays, you're going to see who you lose quite often. So knowing how to deal while losing that person or without that person is going to be one of your first things. If you're not able to get these practices in quite yet, think about who is at the greatest risk in your scenarios and who are you most likely to lose and what the play is after that point. That's just a way to prep for it. But once again, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Until you actually start practicing and doing it in combat, you're not going to really know how it reacts. The roles of building the team are the same roles I talked about last time, the tank, the DPS, the CC, and the support. And when you're building your team, you want to build your team to be somewhat versatile, but you also want to build your team towards your players' strengths. Zach and I spent a lot of car rides thinking up the best meta builds for every class and figuring out the best way to do X, Y, and Z. And then we would be the only people playing that class or playing that version of whatever we wanted. And we run into a lot of problems.
So when you're putting your team together, the best way to go about it is, and I think you touched on it a little bit in the first episode, in basics, you need to be able to work with what your teammates choose to play, and the equipment, the setup, everything, spell lists that they choose to play with, rather than trying to force them into a role. Y- Good tactics will survive changes in equipment and spell list, armor or no armor, what kind of weapons and board combinations people take. So, if you have a team that's a lot more flexible, you have some spellcasters, you have some tanks, you have some DPS, um, you're spread out a little bit more. You can do more rigid tactics that require less loss because your team has the flexibility. But if you come out and your team is 5 barbarians and an assassin, you do not have a lot of flexibility in your team setup. So you need to choose a tactic that is more flexible in what is allowed to happen, and the tactics still work, because your team itself doesn't have that flexibility.
Yeah, it's also playing to your players' strengths. Like it's really like when we first started, when the Tigers were practicing our little tactic here, we had Sir Nifty as our paladin with a polearm. And what we found is that Nifty is not as aggressive with a polearm as we probably needed them to be. Where if we switch it out, so I was a druid with a polearm, I was much more aggressive and I was willing to use my speed pole and just poke all of the time. And it was better for us also because Nifty is a lefty. So what we were able to do is basically take one of our 2 defenders, and one person was a righty, one person was a lefty. We created a pyramid shape, and we had a lot more potential threat to use because we had a lefty and a righty on different sides and a very aggressive DPS. So moving your players around to fit their strengths is going to be part of working with your team and figuring out where they fit. Most people fit a role, and that's kind of how they play most of their classes. There's not a lot of people that play all of the roles. There's very few that play more than 2, and almost nobody plays all. Those that play all are the ones that I can think of that play all are all battle masters because they've broken down how to do everything. They know how their classes work. They know what other classes work, and they know what each thing can do to the beneficial. They still have a tendency to play each thing in a specific style. So like Hajj is fairly aggressive. Even Battlemaster Hajj's support class versions are still kind of aggressive because Hajj is a good stick fighter. They know that they can kick some ass. So Hajj goes out there and will be a support player, but also go kill people because Hajj is a DPS, really. Like, it's hard to not be a DPS when you have good stick skill, good understanding of the rules, and very quick spell casting. So Hajj can play all of them. Hajj normally plays towards a DPS. I personally play closer to support most of the time, or CC, because I'm more strategic and I'm not quite as aggressive. So even if I play a tank role, I'm still going to play it in a positioning. I'm going to use my positioning to try to move things around. If I'm playing a DPS, I play a DPS kind of weirdly because I just look for openings and then just take advantage of those openings in small ways to push the field around. I'm still not really killing everybody I can see. I'm just killing particular people to deal with what I want. So I play more towards a CC support style than a DPS style. Like, you're going to see how players move and how they react. And as they learn about themselves and as you learn about them, you're going to be able to pick and choose what roles fit them best versus what roles they may want to try, or which roles they're going to play in a different style than traditional. When you're choosing your class compositions, I almost took this part out, I'll be honest, because it very rarely do you get to look at the whole list, like look at what's your battle games are going to happen and be like, this person will play this class, this person will play this class, this person will play this class, this person will play this class. And when you are given that opportunity, it's very rarely that you're able, like, the how do I put this? Okay, so I was put in charge of making a Tiger team at a different dungeon day where they just literally were like, these are the classes. We all listed off the classes we would like to play. And I took those lists of classes and I adjusted and made spell lists for everybody and made some stuff. Even doing that, some of us weren't prepared to play the way and the class exactly that we had put on the list because we didn't practice that thing. So creating your tactics around specific class composition is a little tricky. It's better to do it around generalized roles, and then it allows for versatility so you can switch things up as you go.
Well, yeah. So, like, if you say tank is a role.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a class. So, it's basically going to be anybody with armor or a board.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about how many different classes and how many different combinations of equipment and armor you can have to fill that role. It really opens up the possibilities of who's going to be able to step into that role.
Yes. And I'm learning to fight in armor because, like, I have a Paragon Assassin and I fought in Gambison for that. And I'm now trying to step into Anti-Paladin and Barbarian where I'm using more armor, and fighting in armor is wonky. And I honestly don't know how you kept track of all of the math during your Paragon Warrior push Balder, because I'm getting confused, like, way more than
I'm not going to lie. When you dive into like 5 people at once, you're not going to be able to count everything. I just typically would like fight until I feel like I've definitely been hit enough that I could just call dead. And in most of those cases, I probably took fewer hits than were needed to actually kill me because people would be hitting me on the arms, the legs, the torso.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of spread out stuff. But yeah, it kind of comes down at that point to knowing when to just say I'm not counting and I'm just dead. But when if you're stepping up on one person or 2 people doing that fight, moving on, it's a lot easier to count and keep track of things accurately.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's also a different mentality, and that's part of playing to the player's strengths and playing to what they know is important. And when you're doing the class composition, you have to take that into effect. You also have to take into effect what they are comfortable doing within that class. So, like, somebody may list wizard, but it might just be Warlock Wizard. They're really good at Warlock Wizard, but they have no idea how to play Ball Wizard. Like, that could be the thing. Or in the case that I've done a couple times, I've come up with a spell list and I've been like, this is an awesome spell list for a team of this like style. We're going to do this. And then I give it to another player on the team and they're like, what the hell am I looking at? Why do I have no meta class? I have so many weird things on this list. I don't know what their purpose is. And it's like, I had an intention with putting everything on that list. I know what they're all supposed to do. Not everybody else is going to have that. So when you're doing class composition with your team, be prepared to switch things up on the fly or be prepared to adjust as needed with what you have and what you could be using. And just remember or try to keep track of what people are more comfortable playing.
And not just adjustments like an entire class changing, but also adjustments within your list and like what equipment you're bringing. Because if somebody on your team is like, well, I'll play warrior, and they don't bring their armor, but you have a druid, well, maybe that avatar of nature druid is going to have to take some high level spells, some high level enchantments for that warrior to give them some armor to compensate for the fact that they have shown up to play a tank class and have no tank capability.
Yeah, we'll get more into that in an advanced class of like piecemealing together your adjustments with specific abilities, because the more you get into specific abilities, the more into the weeds and the more tricky everything gets, and the more specialized you make your team, the more it doesn't work in other places. Which when you build classes, when you build your team with classes, you normally end up doing that direction where you're like, oh, this team is designed to do X. Okay, that means it's probably bad at Y. And that's just based on the way our game is designed. It's very hard to do a team that is designed to do everything as well as a specified team is able to do.
It's like the jack of all trades versus how does it go?
Jack of all trades, master of none. Is that what it is?
But better than a master of one.
Yeah, something like that.
That's like the whole thing. But the more you spread yourself out to be able to cover more scenarios, the less effective you're going to be for each scenario. And so you can kind of really get hammered if you hit the same situation over and over and over again, because now you've got a lot of stuff going on in your team that isn't applicable.
Yeah. If you did build your team for something specific and you're not, and like you weren't part of the strategy building team where like you designed what's supposed to be happening in the game, then be prepared that you might not fit correctly in the strategy, or be prepared to like adjust as needed. If you were, and this has happened a couple times, and it's more advanced than not, but it does happen. So I'm gonna mention it. If you are part of the strategy team building the strategy for a game, and you see that there's a need for a specific squad of people to do whatever, building your team to do that squad is normally okay, because you have the knowledge that that this is what we're going to be doing. You know what the plan is. You have all the information. You can build a team that's designed to do what they need to do. Without that side of it, building a team to do one specific task normally ends up biting you in the butt more than it does benefiting you. So it's a little bit of balance. You can do the very specific thing, being a master of one thing, but it normally ends up being more problematic than not. We have some examples of what a couple different versions of fields kind of need, just to get your brain moving and like understanding how these things work. And I don't think, okay, we're going to explain why, but not entirely, because part of it is I want you to learn and experience how it works, why, or figure out why these things are this way. So like dungeon crawls need sustainability and tight maneuvers, and you normally need a strong front with a healer or a resurrection support. CC is also very powerful, but it does fall apart without a front line. Some of that is pretty logical. a dungeon crawl, you don't normally have a lot of respawns, or you get more points if you take less respawns. Your tight maneuvers, dungeon crawls are normally kind of tight. You don't have a lot of space, so you have to be able to play in those areas. Everything else in there involves how the dungeon is built, and those are the things you need in it. If you can look at a scenario and figure out what are the problems, and having answers for them built into your tactics, it's going to be a lot better for you long term, because you'll be able to adapt to any situation instead of just kind of putting these cookie cutter examples that we have. The offensive if you're on the offensive side of a siege, you need a strong front line because you need to break through stuff. You have the CC or DPS behind it to clear doors and hallways, and you need alternate teams able to deal with the wall situations, right? There's other things that offensive sieges also need. I want you to figure that out. Part of homework. Defensive side of the siege kind of needs the counter to that. You need a lot more support than you need the DPS, but you still need a lot of tank. You need counter CC, which when I say counter CC, I mean like the ability to counteract whatever CC people are putting on you. If that's, positional CC, you need to have people that are strong to hold their positions. If it's actual like class or caster ability CCs, you need releases and mends and everything else to deal with that problem. And then ways to deal with the alternate teams that are most likely going to be coming through the walls, either through teleportation, blink, or whatever. I wrote forest battles, but I keep rethinking it in my head. What do you think about what I've got written, Boulder?
I mean, honestly, I think the true fourth category is just open field, and forest battles are a kind of open field. They just have a lot more terrain obstacles. But when it comes to open field battles, you need a lot of flexibility. You need some support and CC to help hold your front lines, recuperate from things that happen, mitigate loss. But tanks are going to be a lot less prevalent in open field games, because open field games require a lot of flexibility and movement, flanking, counter flanking, and so your tanks are not as mobile as your DPS. So you're going to end up with a lot more DPS in open field games if you want your tactics to work well.
Yeah, I find open field games are very influenced by the objective. Like especially in a game that like involves moving a lot of stuff. I don't like tanks because they're less beneficial to me most of the time. If it's in like if I got to run stuff back and forth all the time, I'm not going to wear a person out who's in armor doing that. I'll normally do self-sufficient, DPSs or something like that, or CCs that can kind of, control the field enough that they can walk away and leave situations they don't want to. Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to playing a role like another role.
Mm-hmm.
So where you were in the dungeon and you had Hopper, she was a tank, but she became a DPS for your tactics. A lot of your tanks, if you end up with a lot of tanks in an open field game, they are going to have to flex into running DPS for strategies more so than trying to be a tank. Because if I have a giant open field and I have all this space to move, a 6-point warrior with a tower shield sitting in the middle of the field is not a threat to me. They are not an advantage for the other team. They basically don't matter. Because if I'm not wearing the same amount of armor and I don't have the same amount of equipment, I'm going to be able to outrun them. I'm going to be able to outmaneuver them, and I'm going to be able to go for the objective and do the things that I need to do for my team while they're just going to sit in the middle of the field and do nothing.
Yeah. It's uh the open field has so much space as a resource that if you don't take advantage of it, you are just losing out on a resource that is needed. And tanks are normally very good at dealing with holding an amount of space, but it's a limited amount of space where a mobile anybody that's much more mobile, even a tank that is more mobile is going to be more beneficial because they can take advantage of the space that is around them and deal with that situation. Practice. We talked about this a little bit, but I am a fan of drills, of running drills with your team where you start with your positioning, whatever position you want to start with, either the advantageous, the disadvantageous, and then do like, okay, we're doing movement forward. Like you have your squad leader or a coach on the side calling out the plays that you're doing, and you just run them with nobody involved. It's just you guys running what's supposed to happen. So you know what's supposed to happen. Once you know what's supposed to happen, you can then run them against people, and you can do you can see how they change. But you also, everybody in the play, once you have those drills down, they know what's supposed to happen, so they can kind of direct themselves into getting what's supposed to happen happening as often as possible, and they can compensate for where things are falling apart. And if something consistently keeps falling apart, it's time to change that tactic slightly. There's two types of people that are going to be calling out the drills for the most part when you're doing these practices. And when you're doing it in the field, when you're starting to do in the field practice, a coach and a squad leader are two different roles that are essentially doing a similar job of calling the plays, making the decisions. These are normally going to be your peoples that are more strategic minded. They have a lot of quick thoughts. They're pretty good at organizing what they see and putting it into action. And depending on if they're good at doing it while they're in the fray or if they're good at doing it from the back outside of it, kind of depends on what style they're going to do. A coach is not in the game. They're normally an outside player or a person that's allowed to influence the game through communication, but not in any other way. For things like Phoenix League, jugging, Gauntlet, Murder Ball, a coach is going to be a pretty good beneficial person that's going to be able to call plays as they see things happening and let the players focus on what they need to do. A squad leader is going to be much more common because that person is on the battlefield dealing with the situations right in front of them, and they're going to be making the plays. Both of these can both be on the same team, on the same field. You can have both of them going at the same time. I know that plenty of times our coach in lacrosse would call a play. We'd start the play. It wouldn't work. We'd reset, and one of our captains would call a different play, and that's what we'd start doing. And that's similar, where the coach does have a good outside perspective, but they may not have all the information. And that squad leader might have the same situation, like the opposite situation. They have more information about the internal workings, but not the whole picture. So having both of them is helpful, but you don't always have the opportunity to have both.
And it really does come down to perspective, separating the two. The coach has sort of an aerial view. They can see the whole field, but they will not be able to maybe understand why a tactic isn't working, because they'll miss little things that are upfront and in person and in the moment. So the coach might keep calling for a tactic, and it just keeps failing, and they're like, hey, I don't know why this is failing. Well, the squad leader, who has a little bit more of a tunneled view, but they are in the middle of it, they could say, oh, well, our board is stepping too far forward and actually blocking off the pole's range of attack on their swings. And so that's why this tactic keeps failing, because our front isn't working together properly. Um, and like you maybe couldn't see it from where you were, but me, the squad leader, being a pole, I noticed that our board keeps getting too far forward, and I can't protect them. They can't protect me. So that difference in perspective and working both of those perspectives together to be able to change up tactics and strategies as the game progresses according to what is happening is what's going to make a really strong team and a team that can uh, improvise in the moment.
Mhm. And we've got a point later where we talk about how field structures normally are broken down and like what each field structure's role is. And if you don't have a coach, that coach role kind of falls to other field commanders. And we'll explain that a little bit later. But it's a lot of kind of knowing what people's jobs are and then dealing with micro versus macro. I think starting your practices with drills for tactics is a good way to do it. Uh, a lot of the time, you can also try practicing by breaking it down into smaller components. So, like if you know one of your points is a flank bit, like that tactic I was talking about earlier with Hopper running off to the side, we practiced Hopper doing 2v1s, 3v1s, I think up to a 4v1, a couple practices in a row to get Hopper used to dealing with multiple players in armor and how to deal with those situations. To the point that like that part of the tactic we had practiced much more often than anything else because Hopper felt like they wanted the practice to do it. When we got into doing the full tactic itself, we only did it about 6 or 7 times, and then in a practice, and then we'd start doing other parts of it to get better breakdown understanding. Because like as a whole, it was fairly simple what we were doing, but there was individual parts of it that we wanted to get better at. So like who was being more aggressive with the polearm, or how do we defend the polearm correctly? And that some of that was literally just like we have the paladin, the polearm person standing in place, and the other two's job is to defend as long as possible against a team of 5 while that polearm kills as many people as possible. Just getting that polearm used to killing, getting those 2 defenders used to doing their job while dealing with an imbalance and getting better at how to deal with that situation. And then we, after we did this for a little while, we'd throw back in everybody else and we'd try the tactic again, see how things went. It's a lot of understanding the parts and then being good at the parts to make sure the whole works together. That covers everything for practicing your tactics with allies. The other side is doing this with random players. This is a lot shorter because there's only so much you can do with random players. Unlike with practicing with a team, you cannot obscure what you're doing without verbalizing what you're doing. Like you can't call a play that nobody else knows. So if you want people to come to you, you have to call them to you. If you want them to move forward, you have to tell them to move forward. And it really comes down to understanding how players will react and if players will react to your call. I know, and Boulder, this has probably happened to you too, where like I make a call that I'm like, hey, we should do this. And then 2 people follow me and the other 2 people don't. And then the plan falls apart because it's like, no, we needed at least 3 of you to come join me for this plan. And I just didn't get the people. Like this happens frequently in Ditch.
I mean, honestly, working with randoms, your tactics are going to have a much higher rate of failure.
Oh,
period. Yeah. No matter how you try to set them up, no matter how you try to explain them, no matter how you try to execute them, you know, if you are grabbing randoms, especially at like big kingdom events, inner kingdom events, chances are the randoms that you grab are not going to be people of any sort of significant skill. They're just going to be people who are there to play, to have fun, to be a part of the game. And these are going to be people who, even if they are practiced, they haven't practiced with you.
Yeah.
So they're not going to know necessarily all the time that you're talking to them, what you're talking about. Um, so yeah, running tactics with randoms is definitely much more difficult. And if you can get it to work, props to you because it's hard.
It's yeah, I've got two examples of one of a success and one of an utter failure that I had in this working with randoms. In the 2018 Keep Barbarian Siege, which was one of the last games where there was everybody on the attacking side was barbarians and a couple of druids and a couple of healers, and everybody on the opposing side was any kind of class they wanted to be. I pulled together about 10 to 15 people to do a defensive line to step against a castle wall so we could all charge and attack and try to break through real quickly. In that, I had armor on, I had been up in the front, I had been being loud, I was already trying to give orders and things like that. And what I ended up doing was I started about 10 steps back from where I wanted to start the line, and I grabbed two people to stand next to me, and I just kept calling boards forward, defense, step, 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 and I kept calling step and pounding my board, and other people started seeing that this was going on, and they started lining up, and we got about 10 to 15 people lined up, taking steps together, defending against these polearms and these arrows, and we got all the way up to the castle, which was great. It was awesome. It fell apart at that point because I didn't have a plan past that. I was just trying to get everybody to the castle so we could start attacking. But we made this random group of people work together for a tactic. The failure happened at this past Keeps game, and it was using some of the better fighters in the game. So I've got a little layout of kind of what was going on. Is the opposing side had a spread of people, but they had one really big scary dude with a very long polearm that was beating up basically anybody that came within 6 to 7 feet of him. And he was holding a side kind of by himself. I was playing a caster. Jamie was playing, Lily Sunshine was playing some variety of Barbarian, I think. And I had Cue Ball behind me. I had a McNichols. I had somebody else over here. I had somebody like this. And I put my hand on Jamie's back and I said, I'm taking down the pole. And I heated the pole. He stepped back. And then I pushed on Jamie and said, go, expecting the Cue Ball would notice, McNichols would notice, my other team members would notice that Lily just charged forward and I just charged forward. And what happened was Lily killed 2 people. I killed 1 person and the polearm, and then the rest of their team swarmed in and killed us because nobody behind us knew what was going on. I failed to communicate that we're charging. I basically just told Lily that we're moving, and nobody followed. So that was a failure on my part to communicate, like, we're about to charge, and I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything besides move, and it failed. In my head, it was going to be awesome because based on the situation that we had created, Jamie could take down a couple people, Q could take down a couple people. Like, we should have crushed this side. But the simple action of I didn't call charge or move or forward or anything like that, it just got Lily and I killed. Which proves that you definitely need to just communicate. Otherwise, it won't work. People can't read your minds. Which is why you need one-line commands or easy commands that are communicating the idea of what's happening without a lot of confusion. So this is one of those situations where you normally don't want to use jargon. You want to use something that means exactly what you're doing, and you're going to end up in a better result from random players than you are if you start using something that might not apply to them every day. So you don't get to practice these. obviously, but you want them to be, you want to kind of understand how they're going to work and have that in mind, and then kind of understand how the players are going to react to it. And to practice this, you're literally just going to have to not tell anyone a plan and try doing it during ditching, during small battle games, during large battle games, and just get practice with seeing how people react to your orders, essentially. If you're trying to defend a point, like tank, stay, defend, those normally get the idea. If you're trying to advance,
I mean, just saying hold, honestly.
I worry about hold because if you say hold too much, people call a field hold.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, I did call hold for like people to hold a point, and somebody started calling like, well, who's hurt? And I was like, no, hold the point. Oh, never mind.
Yeah, that is a complication.
If you call out hold, you have to add something else to it, because if you just say hold, fortunately on the humanitarian side, Amp-Garders will be like, oh, somebody's hurt, hold, everyone hold. On the strategic side, nobody knows that you're telling them to hold their position.
Yeah, like hold this point.
Yeah.
Or something.
Hold the flag.
Quick to say, people get the idea.
Yeah. Advancing, if you're doing forward, like advance, forward step, if you're doing one of those, you have to set the pace and expect that some people will not follow your pace. The best success I have is to like make the pace part of whatever you're trying to describe. So like advance. If you want people to take steps at that rate, if you want them to run forward a little faster, step, go, and just try to push that kind of thing. It's a little tricky, but you get used to it. Same with retreat. Zach, have you ever called for a retreat with randoms?
I mean, I've definitely used like pull back. Like if we're fighting with randoms and we've got sort of a front line and some people, maybe some newer people or just people who haven't worked with us before get kind of into it, they tunnel vision and they play the hero. They want to just step forward. They want to push weaknesses. They want to fill holes. They just kind of lose sight of where the rest of their team is, and they get too far forward.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying pull back can work. And if you're working with randoms, depending on the size of the field, people might not hear you. People might not understand, even if they hear you, or they might just ignore you.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a couple times gotten people to just pull back with me. And once you get them back retreated with you to a good point, you can explain things to them a little more. But keeping that simple, just pull back, hold the line, charge, like
Mm-hmm.
1 or 2 word commands really is going to drive the point home. And that's where you got to be careful with your choice of words too.
Yeah.
So that people can really just understand it without being explained what it really is.
Right. Because we're just expecting them to understand based on literally a word most of the time. The one that I've only called for it once, and I've seen it called for a number of times, and I've never seen it work without a practiced team, is charge. Partially because nobody runs at the same speed without practice. Like those movies that you see someone yell charge and like the whole army runs forward at the same similar pace. That's because they've practiced that. They've trained to do that thing. If you just tell a bunch of Amp-Garders to charge, you're going to have one person sprinting way off to the side, like way faster. Somebody's going to be slow. You're going to have somebody literally walking. It turns the whole line that you just created into this like spread field, which then means their offensive or defensive line, whatever they're doing, can just kind of walk through your individuals as they go. It's hard.
I have had some success with this. It doesn't always work, but like if you're looking to incite a charge on short notice and have it work, um, you cannot typically be the point.
No.
You can't typically be the tip of the spear because if you are trying to yell a command to people and you are running out in front of them, they probably will not hear you or just will not hear you as well.
Hmm.
And you're probably going to end up in a situation similar to left side push at keep, where you just run in and immediately get overwhelmed because you don't have support. The way that I have been most successful with inciting a charge on short notice, especially with randoms, is to notice a hole or notice a weak point in the line and just start yelling like forward, go, charge, like, and sometimes using a different word each time um, does help, or just repeating the same word very quickly, like you were saying earlier, like go 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 go.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Typically, if I'm gonna do that, I will position myself behind a couple of people, so I can just kind of like tap on them with my sword, or like nudge them with my shield or something. Just very gentle, to just sort of get their attention along with the words and give them that little bit of a nudge that tells them like, "Hey, go forward."
Hmm.
Um, and if you can get 2, maybe 3 people to move, they will run in, you follow behind, and then that's usually enough people to get other people next to you guys to sort of follow up on um, on the wings. But that keeps you a little bit safer. Um, it allows you to commit along with them, and if you have a bunch of armor, or if you have a little more stick skill, or just general battle game capability, those people are going to push forward. They're going to meet the enemy where they are, and you will be able to fill holes and react appropriately, instead of you trying to make the holes and having people who you don't know what their skill level is try to do that job for you. Sometimes the best way to handle an issue is to just throw bodies on top of it. And if you can get a
Hmm.
couple bodies moving, chances are you're going to be able to pull a couple extra bodies along with you. But if you move by yourself, people will more often than not just watch you go up and die,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. That happens way more than I'd like. Eh, When you're doing random player tactics, my rule of thumb is 3. You need at least 3 additional people to do whatever you want your goal is. You need at least 3 additional people before others start paying attention to you. If you've got some clout, like, people know who you are, or perhaps you're one of the field commanders they've been told to listen to, whatever, then you don't necessarily need as many people because they're trained, they're told to listen to you. But most of the time I've needed like 3 to 5 people to start listening to me first before things have gone, until or recently when my name's been more popular. But like up until that point, it was a lot of, hey, we need to go there. Hey, 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 hey. And I know there's examples of like, oh, we put together a posse and we did X. Like that happens and that works. Um, it's just always a little harder to get to work the way you want it to than the planned practice tactics that you can do with your team. Um, it's tricky. We're gonna move on to strategy. Uh, when you're building your strategies, and this is for, in my opinion, anytime you're building your strategies, you still have to follow this KISS rule, because uh, the strategy never, the plan never survives the enemy because people panic, is my reasoning. It doesn't matter how good of a strategy you come up with. If people can't remember what they're supposed to do, it won't happen. So especially because strategies change from game to game. It's not something they can practice over and over and over and over again. It's something that needs to be able to fit in like a few words that they can catch on to what they're doing, know what they're supposed to be doing, and be able to pass it off. So keep it stupid simple with an asterisk.
It's kind of like a machine. You
Yeah.
know, the more moving parts you have, the less flexibility you're gonna have with the outcomes that you can
Mhm.
do. So you know, you could, if you perhaps called a hammer a machine, you could do a lot of things with a hammer because it
Mhm.
is one piece. But if you have a car, that is a lot of pieces together,
Mhm.
and there's only so many things that you can do with a car.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very hard to build a bench with a car.
Yeah.
Like the simple machines, that's a very good way to put it. Of the simpler the machine, the more versatile it is. I put an asterisk on the KISS, the keep it stupid simple, because some of your team needs to know the whole plan. So if you know what you need to keep the whole plan fairly simple, but you need to also be able to convey what the plan is, or at least what the players need to know the plan is, easy. And then your commanders or your generals can know more of the plan and understand the greater, bigger picture so that they can make decisions based on the whole strategy. Most of the time, your players just need to know, like, hold this location, go get this thing, beat up that dude, stay away from that place, whatever. Like, they just need to know what the general plan is in a quick couple of words, so that they can continually keep doing it. And anytime someone gets added in or taken out or whatever, they can easily catch on to what the plan is. This also it also follows my rule for building battle games. If you're building a battle game, whatever your respawn timer is, the game should be easy enough to explain in the time it takes to respawn. The same rule applies with your strategy. However long it takes to respawn, you should be able to explain your strategy, because if your strategy is too complicated to explain in 30 seconds, if that's the respawn location, people are not going to do it for this game. They have more fun just killing people than they do figuring out what your goal is. So, quick, easy explanations. Now that we're in intermediate and advanced, when we do advanced, you need to know what your weaknesses are in your strategy are, and you need to know how to find them you need to know how to find them from the outside. That's going to be an advanced skill that you're going to pick up, but for the most part, whenever you build your strategies, also figure out what the weakness is, so that you know if it starts going badly, what if that weakness is being exploited, so that you have more information than just like, I don't know why it didn't work. You know what the weaknesses are, you're going to have a better time building a simpler and stronger strategy, versus if you have so many moving parts and so many weaknesses, you don't know what's going wrong.
I mean, the best example, tale as old as time, is if you want to run a line tactic, we're gonna make a line and we're gonna hold it and we're gonna slowly advance it. What's the biggest weakness of a line?
It's
Flanking.
Yeah, it's flanks.
Like, if anybody gets around behind you, you're done. Your entire line crumbles because they either need to turn around to combat the flank and expose their back to the enemy, or they need to continue fighting the enemy and die to the flank. You know,
Yeah.
being able to look at your tactic when you make it and find the weakness, looking at it from the outside, then you can start to implement backup and flexibility and figuring out how to make advantages out of the disadvantages that come with your tactics.
Mm-hmm. And that's, for right now, that's going to be more an advanced skill of like recognizing your own weaknesses and planning counter plays and stuff like that to it. That's a little bit more advanced, but it is something you want to start thinking about at this point when you're building your strategies. Because A lot of battle games can include having two teams having the same strategy. Unlike tactics, two strategies working at the same time do not always counter each other out. Tactics normally do. If both teams are playing line, they both kind of just twirl. If both teams are playing flank, they both kind of just twirl. If both teams are playing flank one side with the whatever, like normally what happens if both teams play the same tactics, it's a null point. If both teams play the same strategy, it doesn't always end up being the same thing because the general strategy goals are kind of too broad to counteract each other for the most part. Sometimes they can be counterproductive or not work with each other, but not all the time, which is why I don't say it's a hard rule that like two teams playing the same strategy will always counteract each other, because it doesn't always happen.
At the very least, for intermediate, you want to be able to identify the weak points of your strategy and why they're weak points of your tactic and why they're weak points. You don't necessarily need to think about counter tactics yet, but knowing where you're weak in your setup will help you to play better because you can consciously compensate for that weakness as opposed to just barreling out onto a field with a tactic and getting crushed every single time because you don't know what your weakness is and you can't compensate for it.
Similar to last time I talked about a capture the flag tactic, where if you've got, or a tactical strategy, sorry, it was a strategy where you got the two teams and you have to go retrieve the opponent's flag while also still having your flag. And if you do that, you decide that you're going to do a feint, so you have a bunch go this way while the actual person trying to score goes this way. If they do the same thing, they run into this is what it looks like, which now means that you basically turn into a speed race trying to figure out who gets what, and it in this case it turns null. But if they do the inverse, you now end up with a slightly different game because they have these two members have all this space to kind of go run, and they can go retrieve things, and you have all of the resource of these players to go deal with those situations as they arise and change. You know your weakness, essentially, if your strategy is feint one side hard and run the other side, that the side you're running your single player on is your weak side and is going to be easier for them to run their own strong side or solo down because that's your weak side. You recognize that, you can start planning for how to deal with that situation. You can start trying to modify your strategies so that they compensate for everything. So maybe you don't feint with everyone. Maybe you feint hard with two people or like one of your big threatening people. You try to draw more attention with that without opening the rest of your field up so that this person can still come around and still get the things without opening as much of your weak sides up. For right now, compensate, plan to look at your strategies. So look at your strategies, figure out where they're weak, and figure out if you can make a fix to it that still follows the KISS rule. Until advanced, when you're able to like understand how to manipulate the field and manipulate situations better, that's when you start using some specialist teams. You start using some specific classes and abilities to compensate for different things, because you can probably rely that they're going to be there, or you can choose that they're going to be there, either your ability or somebody else's. Strategy's kind of quick. I don't have too much else for strategy. Do you have anything else, Balder?
I think for intermediate, it's good right for now. We're not getting into counter strategy until advanced, so we really
counter strategy gets complicated. You need to this seems very simple for strategy because a lot of it is just you building up a repertoire or a list of different strategies and understanding how they work. And then once you get into counter strategies, you get to start playing with like piecemealing things together and how to interact with that.
To be honest, I guess one thing I do have to say is that if you're doing it right, the strategy is actually the simple bit.
Yes.
The tactics are the complicated parts.
Yes.
The tactics are the small moving parts, whereas the strategy is just the overarching goal.
Mhm.
It's the title of the chapter, and the tactics are all the different sections of the chapter with all the information in them.
Mhm. It's your strategies. When you're building your strategies, you can take into effect tactics, but for the most part, you're going to build the plan, and the tactics that your players decide to use should always gear towards that plan, uh, because that plan is simple enough that you can fit multiple tactics towards it without it being too specific. If you make
Yeah.
something too specific as a plan, then only a couple tactics work with it, and then it falls apart because it can't support itself.
Yeah, so like if you're playing an open field game, it's your capture the flag like you have set up.
Mhm.
You would say, well, our strategy is to push the flag and bring it back. We need to get somebody forward
Mhm.
enough to grab the flag and come back with it. And one of your teams decides to do a hold strategy, you're done. You're already losing because they've decided to choose a tactic that does not feed into the strategy.
Mhm. And this we'll break this down a little bit more in a second here, but that a lot of that comes down to your field commanders understanding what the plan is, the entirety of the plan, and being able to direct plays and direct movements that are going to be conducive to that plan and not uh, counteractive. So it's strategies should always be like you should, and some of this is going to be because battle games are all kind of different. A single strategy will not work for every single battle game. It'll work for some, it'll work for a couple, but it may not work for all of them, and it might take modifications to make it work better or more efficiently for other things. But because it's all dependent on what the game is, when you're building your strategies in this intermediate, where we're not talking about a ton of specifics, keep them simple, keep them easy enough that people can have the entirety of it stick in their head easily, and they can switch it, every hour or so, whatever, how many ever battle games you have. And then make sure that you can explain whatever part of the plan each squad needs to be a part of within like a couple words. Um, One of the ones that worked, I don't want to say it worked perfectly, but it works pretty well. For me was at Keep 2022. It was a hold multiple location point game where one team had to bring these spore bombs, which are these big 40-gallon or 50-gallon drums, and we had to put them in specific locations. Once we put them in that location, the opposing team could go get a specific game object and walk it over to it to nullify it. The point of the game was to have more controlled points than the opponent, and all of the points started in control of the uh, the defending team. We were on the attacking side. There was a timer associated with the game object to break our spores. So what I had our entire team do was I literally just told them get all of the spores right up next to the locations, but do not put them in the locations. Hold them at that location, and then we're going to just kind of fight for a while until we start getting close to our timer. And once we're close to the end of the game, when they only have enough time to basically kill one of our locations, we're going to just roll all of them in and just hold for as long as possible. We lost by 1 point because of a different, a miscommunication in strategy or a miscommunication in a tactic that I did not communicate well. We had the ability to break one of their things that broke our bombs, and I did not tell people to protect that thing once we let it go. So that broke down, but the plan, everybody was on board with the plan. It worked very well. Everybody did their job. The only fault we had was we just missed doing one step. And that was part of the problem, was that it was simple. The answer was very simple. And I could have made it even simpler by removing the idea of using this extra resource. And if I had done that point, we probably would have won. It's just I told the team, roll them up, hold it there, fight, play as much as you want. And then once I call our timer, roll them in and defend. That was it. The whole plan. And everybody can follow it. So it's similar to that idea of keeping, even though there's more moving parts and there's more extra things that are there for like why this works, why this doesn't work, how that plan exactly breaks down, the actual steps of it are simple. Okay. Field structure. So this is not universal. This is something that this is the way I see battlefields for field structure, and the way that I've ran battlefields that seem to work best to get the most communication and the most control out of your teams. You have your generals. They're the ones that are making the strategy. They are reading the battle games. They're designing the strategy, the plan. They're writing it all out. They have everything set up. And those are the people that know the whole thing. They communicate that plan, that entirety of the plan, before the battle game gets together to your commanders. Normally, you end up with the generals, and the commanders are friends. They're in same fighting companies. They're in households together, whatever. They normally know each other because they work closely enough that they know this person is going to understand what I say when I communicate all these things. The field commanders are macro. They're in charge of sections of the field, like the front line or the support, or the tanks, or they're in charge of a larger role position. Normally, you don't have many of these. You have like one or two, and then everybody else breaks down into the next, which is a squad leader. Squad leaders are micros. They're in charge of just the squads. Your team that you practice your tactics in. They're going to take commands from the squad leaders. They're going to take commands from the generals, but they're also in charge of keeping their team running in the right direction, keeping their tactics moving the way that the strategy dictates. The people that are going to be better frontline commanders, field commanders, are going to be those that are vocal enough that they're able to communicate on large scales, but also strategic enough that they can see enough of the field to know what they kind of have to do while still being near the front. Balder, I think you're a great example of these, because you stay out of the fray until you're needed to control where things are going, and then force pushes and maneuvers and movements so that the overall objective gets scored.
You went over field commanders,
Yeah.
and then were you saying that I am a squad leader?
No, I put you more in the line of like a frontline field commander, because you normally understand the entire strategy and you're good at communicating it. Plus you're loud, which makes a big thing. You and Les both. Les isn't as strategically minded, but Les
But he's loud.
He is very loud. He's very good at telling people what to do. And as long as he knows what his job is to tell people what to do, he's very good at it.
So yeah, general I kind of see as like the coaches. So like a general is never gonna step anywhere near the front line. They're gonna just look at the entire field. They're gonna be communicating the entire time. They're probably not gonna do much when it comes to actively physically helping with the battle game.
Mm.
And then field commanders are kind of like mini coaches. They're like team captains. So they'll, like you said, what I do, I will step back. I will take in a section of the battlefield. I will see who's around me, what needs to happen, and with who. And then I will step forward and I will bring people with me, or I will send people at things. I will fill in if I'm needed.
Mm-hmm.
That's typically more what I like to do, especially if I'm playing a spellcaster. because I have the ranged abilities to supplement the fact that I'm not really actively on the front line. Um, but when I'm playing something like Warrior, I don't have as much ranged capability. I need to make use of the fact that I have all this armor and melee capability. I do tend to become more of a squad leader. Um, I will grab a group of people and I will take them where I see I am needed. And so it's like I'm the one who's going to this spot and I'm the one who's fulfilling this need for my team, but I have muscle along with me.
Mm-hmm.
Um and so like MAME 2023 where I showed up with my fighting company fully armored for the first time.
Yep.
I took on a lot more of a squad leader role where I wasn't observing a lot of the battlefield. I was just looking at what was in front of us, and my tactic was literally called the meatball. And it's just all of us together, and we just roll into whoever is in front of us and create massive holes in the line that the rest of our team can fill and exploit. Um, so squad leaders versus field commanders.
If I remember correctly,
You know,
you guys had 5 or 6 people, all in 3 to 4 points of. I think it was 3 points of armor was max in the
um,
leather.
I think we had 7 people in 3 points of armor.
There's a lot of people. Okay, so you had 7 people, and there was a couple pole arms. I think there was
Yeah, we
two,
had we had
three.
4 polearms, 2 shields, and I had a great sword.
Okay, so you guys had a lot of DPS with the armor to back it up, and I know from playing assassin, I basically decided to avoid the hell out of your guys' squad until I was directly behind you to be able to deal with that
Yeah,
situation, because it I've got it drawn on the map thing. It was basically, this isn't exactly what it was, but it was basically just like an arch with all of the pointy bits in the front, and anything you guys ran into died. It
yeah,
it was hard to deal with, and especially when you guys were pushing a point that we wanted to hold, we really couldn't do much to stop you besides a lot of ice walls, and that only worked on the non-barbarians, which I
yeah. The
was like
once
2 of you.
once the other team started moving CC in front of us, that's when our progress was almost entirely halted. But I mean, I took a bunch of people who haven't done a lot with battle gaming strategically, and I made them effective because I used them as an extension of myself and put myself where I was needed.
Mm-hmm.
So that was more of a squad leader role because I was melee and we had a lot of melee. If you're doing field commandery stuff, you're probably going to want to have a bow or have a ranged capability or be a spellcaster,
Mm-hmm.
because that will allow you to observe more of the field and manipulate the parts of the field that you can see from where you're sitting.
Yeah. Resbots are really good backline commanders because they can see most of the field. They kind of understand where one of the resources are completely coming from, and they have the opportunity to talk to so many people that if like anybody in that little resbot area, people that are either like bards or wizards that are mending things or doing songs of the inspirations and everything like that, like confidence and restoration, like all that stuff, those people are going to have a good view of the field, and as long as they have a little bit of time to analyze and communicate, they're going to do a very good job of like, hey, our left side's looking a little weak, we need to send some reinforcements over there. And because the resbot area is where a lot of people come to resurrect, you can send forces in those areas that need fixing. Yes, you may be fighting people that are like, well, my team's over there. It's like, yeah, I know your team's over there, but we do need you over here for a little bit. They can survive a little longer without you, and then you can go fix your team after we fix, this XYZ problem, whatever. and those field commanders from the back get a better view. Um, the frontline field commanders are a lot more about that, like taking a hole and exploiting it. And the frontline field commanders are about advantageous moves. They always want to find that advantage and utilize it and exploit the crap out of it. The support and backliners are about negating weaknesses. They're about negating those disadvantages. Kind of what normally breaks down. Sometimes they switch back and forth every once in a while because you've got to adjust to what's going on. But most of the time, that's what I see happening on the field. The other thing the field commanders in the back do, which meta, at least for Polaris, is starting to change a little bit. Because DMAG is so prevalent, and we went through the meta of making these big godlike characters with a ton of enchantments on them, and they just get DMAG, so all that work went to waste. We're starting to see a lot more spreads of enchantments and seeing how many more people we can enchant. On top of the fact is we're seeing more players hold enchantments until certain parts of games so that they can make additional pushes. They can make another, strategic retreat or whatever to like power up and then come back out and things like that. And it's those backline commanders are the ones that are kind of deciding when that thing needs to happen or keeping track of the timer when like, oh, we need to make another push now, and then utilizing those resources. Squad leaders, the micro, you're dealing with what goes where. You need to kind of know what the whole plan is. You need to know what the plan is, as does everybody else on your team. But you may want to know slightly more details. You may not. It's just you don't want to go against any of the plan. So you want to know what the general plan is, and then you want to utilize your tactics within your squad to amplify and take advantage of those strategies, or take advantage of that strategy while not hurting it with your tactics. If you're a squad leader in charge of a bunch of randoms, is tricky. It's I'll be honest, if you're a squad leader in charge of some randoms, it's more likely that you're going to be just kind of filling holes and trying to keep people alive as long as possible, rather than like making specific moves to do X, Y, or Z. The other thing in field commanders, and I love these, and I've put Balder on these a couple times. I use most people I know that are battle masters, I try to put on these squads. At least one on the squad. I don't try to load these squads up, but I call them specialist squads, where they're designed to do a specific thing, or they're what I call problem solvers. So if I know that I need like a flank team, I need an airdrop team, somebody that's got teleports and blinks. My problem solvers are normally a group of self-sufficient. It's a self-sufficient squad that knows each other and works well together and has some power, but is not my strongest squad. And I send them to go fix problems that arise. Like, oh, we have the torches on the left side. Okay, they're going to need some extra support. Problem solvers to the left side. The objective is moving a little faster than we'd like. Can we try to slow that down? Problem solvers. Things like that. I throw the problem solvers at my issues, and normally they can deal with the situation and come back to continue to solve problems.
With your problem solver group, I would imagine that CC and DPS are a little more prevalent than tanks and supports.
Mm-hmm. It's normally a group of it's normally got an assassin in it. It's normally got an anti-paladin in it. It sometimes has it normally has a wizard or a bard, and then it almost always has a healer of some variety. Sometimes a druid.
Yeah, I mean you don't want to put too much tank in there because tanks aren't very mobile. And if you have too much support, then while the team has a lot of sustainability, they're going to crumple under large numbers or getting hit by a tank squad. They're just going to be too squishy overall to handle that. You're going to be taken out by stray arrows and throwies,
Yeah.
all kinds. You just run a higher risk of failing if you're too support oriented or too CC oriented. A lot of your DPS can make up for being DPS by slapping on some armor. and it gives them some more survivability.
Yeah, it's I kind of like to design my problem solver teams like a Phoenix League team where they don't really know what they're going to run into, but they kind of always have an objective to do, and it's normally involves pushing forward. So most of my problem solver teams are kind of designed like Phoenix League teams. I don't normally try to push like Errant Dawn as to be a problem solver team because they're too beneficial being an objective focused team in general. Like I don't need them running around and solving side problems when they can just be running the objective like a boss. So somebody that's like a second or a third tier Phoenix League team is one that I'm going to like because they're built well enough that they can work together. They can adjust to what needs to happen, and they have enough versatility that they can deal with most situations. If they run into something that they don't know how to deal with, they can grab somebody normally. I like problem solver teams. They're my favorite tactic. It's just,
I mean, that's in larger games where you have access to more high tier people. Um, for me, putting together a problem solver team kind of scratches the itch of wanting to put that really meta squad together.
yeah.
Um, so it can be really nice as a field commander or a general to finally get to play with your shiny toys instead of just making do with all the hand-me-downs.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I guess, sort of a way to put it. Just because no matter what the meta is, no matter what you think the best possible 5-man squad is that you could put together, you're almost never going to be able to do that and make it work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because you're not going to have people who can play that class, or you're not going to have people who maybe have that particular set of skills to play that class well
Mm-hmm.
or in the way you want. Um, but yeah, in bigger games, like putting together that problem solver squad, you can really get into some meta stuff, especially if you talk to them ahead of the game,
Oh yeah.
and make sure that you and they both know what they are going to need to solve these problems for you.
Mm-hmm. Um, one of my buddy druids are something that I normally put on there. Buddy druids are druids that enchant each other to basically become avatars of nature, but they have less restrictions because they're not putting it on themselves; they're putting it on each other. They're very self-sufficient. They're kind of hard to deal with, and they're very, very versatile. Um, I like to put a paladin or normally an anti-paladin because they're very, very heavy DPS, but they have that tank ability on them. Specifically, if I have like Vitalin and Aurelius and some buddy druids, that 4-man team is devastating as a problem solver because I can just kind of be like, okay, I have a thing for you to do. Go do it. And they go do it. And then they come back to doing whatever they were doing. And they just keep running. Like Aurelius is very good at, you give him a command, he finds the answer to the problem, he deals with it, and then he comes back to doing his initial problem. He's like, I chop it at this wall is what I'm going to do. And I love that kind of stuff when I'm building strategies because it's like, oh, I don't have to worry like, oh, we have a weak flank on our side. The problem solvers will deal with it next time. Like, we'll be fine. Let's give some homework, people. I know it's not fun, but it is getting to hit your friends, so it is kind of fun. Homework. For tactics, plan and practice some tactics, do some drills. That's my homework for you if you want to get better at this thing. It's a lot more beneficial if you practice everything, you get good at what you're doing because you need to practice this stuff, otherwise it doesn't work. Practice your tactics, draw up some tactics, get used to them, run them by your friends, see how they work, practice them. Try different roles in your your teams, in your tactics. See if there's another role that you might also be able to fit into. See if there's other roles that some other people might be able to work with. just so everybody has a full complement of roles that they understand how they play, and then you as a squad commander or as the people like as a team understand where you can put people based on what's going on. It's
Cross training.
yes, yeah. You don't want to be stuck doing one thing the whole time. So learning how to do additional things is going to help. And then practice your team movement and your tactics during ditch is a very easy way to do it. Do it during battle games if you get the opportunity, but don't ruin people's fun. Obviously, don't make a power squad on one side and the other is just a bunch of new players. Practice park days are for practice and for fun. One of the things you can do, which Balder and I have done twice now, I think, is we put together our Phoenix League team or we put together a power team, whatever, and then we're like, all right, park versus us. If it's built well, it works. It would like I think it was 5 of us or 6 of us.
Well, we had 7 because we ran our alternates
Oh,
along
yes.
with us at the same time, but it was like 7 versus 25 or something,
Yeah,
and we still won.
yeah. I mean, to be fair, it was 3 so we weren't battle masters at the time, but 3 of us on the team are now battle masters. All of us are paragons and at least one paragon, and most of us have 2. So
Two people who were on the team were also warlords. Are
oh
are also
yeah, are
warlords
also
now.
warlords. Yes,
Oh.
that's right. Yeah, so it wasn't uh it was a well-built team. Um but doing you can still do those things if you feel like your team's going to be too overpowered for your park to deal with, or like on a regular park day situation. Do these wildly outbalanced things to see if you can make your tactics work, and then take the successes from those individual little moves and like the things that actually work on a small scale and you know take them to the next step, advance them, get better at them. Because if you can use your tactics when you are disadvantaged by so much, those are going to be so much better and out just crush people if you are on a fair, even grounds, or if you have the advantageous imbalance. So practice those things. For strategy, write a bunch of strategies. Kind of what I want you to do. Take your general battle games, like your park normally plays in a month. They play a couple of battle games. They normally cycle through. They repeat sometimes. Build a strategy for each one of them, and then try to get at least one of your strategies played every park day. For the ones that don't get played, compare them against what did get played. Make sure to analyze, see what happened, see if you could improve it, see what your weaknesses are, and always keep coming back to your basics. Check your resources every single time. Check your resources and see the other one that you now want to focus on is, was the objective played? Because 9 times out of 10, a team that loses is a team that wasn't playing the objective. And you can kill everybody on the opposing squad or the opposing team like 20 times. But if you never do the objective, you'll never win. So check that. When you're doing your strategies, don't force metas. We talked about it a lot. We talked about it a lot and we hit on it a couple times. Don't force people into a class and don't force people into a specific build. Let them play what they want to play. If it fits in the way your strategy works or your tactic works, great. If it doesn't, see if you can fill that role if you need it, or just try to build strategies that don't require hyper-specific things. If you build it to more generic things, like we're going to need a teleport, there's like 3 classes that have a teleport. 4 classes that have a teleport. If you need, you need to have ice balls, there's several classes that have ice balls. If you need somebody that has a bunch of armor, a lot of classes have a bunch of armor. Like, build towards more generics than specifics, and then don't force things on people. Yeah.
One way to look at that as well is that there's a lot of ways to build a house, and there's a lot of things that you can build a house with. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you build a house with and how you build that house. If it keeps the rain off your head, it's doing what a house needs to do.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be the perfect house. It doesn't have to look like your dream house. It just has to keep the rain off your head. So if you are able to use the people around you and what they have to make your tactics work, that is going to work better every time than trying to shove people into playing classes and meta things and whatever that they are not used to playing.
Yes. Yes. All right. I think that's all we've got. Once again, thank you for listening. We don't have anybody in our live recording today. It's a little late, so that's kind of expected sometimes. So if you have questions, you have things you want to talk or discuss about, make sure to comment on the videos and the podcast. Comment, put questions out there. Even if you message on Facebook, I'm pretty responsive. So let's get more discussions going. If you have things you want to bring up, always drop us a line. And we'll hope to see you guys in the field. Stay on the path.
Goodbye.